All right, so I figured that given that we have both representatives from the vision science community and industry here together, I'd like to open it up for more general questions. So if you have a question, please come up to the microphone. If not, I'll ask the questions. And we'll see how the folks here like that. Hello?
Oh, good. So I'm wondering, a lot of issues have been presented with augmented and virtual reality. You described a lot of these that are current, it sounds like, engineering problems. What's the most pressing problem that you think that we could contribute to in the short term, perhaps? Because at least with some of these, for example, screen resolution, the vision science community isn't necessarily able to address that design problem, but for example, with foveated rendering or with other focus cues, these are things that we might be able to address. Yeah.
Okay, I think that what we just heard, those are hard problems, low-hanging fruit in a way. We can call it that way, but very, very hard problems to solve and to understand. And that was a very good summary. So problems around foveated rendering, what we actually using, and are we going to use peripheral vision? What happens if you kill the resolution? What are the unforeseen problems? It's a little bit like what Emily talked about when she said people with presbyopic people, they have unexpected effects and benefits, right? It's something that, you know, and Vision Sim can help in this foveated rendering work because especially NVIDIA, they're trying to solve a very hard problem that would push on the entire ecosystem of industry by creating those technology. So we can drive a lot of pixel faster and in real time. So that is a big problem, I think. And it's a within the vision science community, it's also a multi-angle problem that many different wedges and expertise can help solving. This is my take.
No, is it on?
Okay. Pass over that mic.
I'll just grab this mic. Sure. Yeah, I think in terms of short-term opportunities, foveated rendering is a really obvious an obvious one. I think for what you just heard, a related problem is eye tracking, and obviously this is an engineering problem a great engineering problem as well as a vision science problem. But to make really robust eye trackers that work, in broad daylight, that work robustly on 99% or better of the population is super hard, as you all know. And I think that there's definitely a place where people understand the eye to help us there.
Well, if I can add to that, in fact, the problem of foveated rendering is a 3D problem because we're gonna foveate in X, Y, but we're gonna foveate in Z once we get what Emily was talking about. So, and are we sure that we can deliver that resolution that we need in an eye tracker binocularly? That's probably more engineering than vision science, but maybe some vision scientists drove those eye trackers to the limits already, so they did a lot of R&D implicitly.
I'll just add one other thing. It's not a specific challenge to address, but it's just the fact that as we're designing these AR and VR displays, there's questions we want to answer about optimizing different characteristics, and the literature that we look to was never done on these kind of displays or have like head tracking in the mix and all these things. So we have to go back and kind of retest some of these understandings in the different contexts of VR and AR.
There is another important thing, all the issues related to transparency. So in AR, those are displays that are transparent displays, so it takes a lot of understanding of what the implications of having a transparent display with no black, for example, are.
So while we are on the foveated rendering, this is like a topic of my interest. So we always talk about rendering side, but have you guys been thinking about, so once you render it, now you have to transmit all this data to the display, right? Any thought on that? It's like, okay, you rendered it, but how do you send it? Like the file gets bigger, you can't really send all this data over. Any thoughts? Like bigger pixels, what do you do with them?
I'll take the first. Maybe I'm just too dumb to turn this one on. It's off? Okay, okay. Foveated compression and foveated transmission and display is huge. I think that's really important. Just to put a little context in that, even pretty exotic wireless, everybody wants to get rid of the tether, right? Nobody wants to be dragging this cord around. And in some cases, it's like HoloLens is already tackling, it's completely necessary. But even pretty exotic 60 gigahertz wireless solutions are not really robust enough for the kind of pixel counts that we want to push, at the frame rates we want to push. And so I think foveated compression is going to play a huge part in that. I absolutely agree.
Yes, there's a CVNet discussion that's like raging right now about what the bit rate is of the optic nerve, and I guess it's relevant. It's the same problem in a different guise. I want to go to the next question.
Stefan had alluded to the issue of perception and action, and I noticed that all of these displays, or most of them, are working at distances like 1 meter or more, which is beyond peripersonal space and beyond action space. So I'm wondering, especially from the company representatives, if any of the research is going in that direction of looking at, for example, how you could render arms, how you could work with things that are more in peripersonal space.
Are you talking about focal distances in particular? You're talking about focal distances? Focal distances. Because, I mean, I can talk for our product, we're optimized for desk use space, for example. So we have everything set up for peripersonal space. So I don't get exactly what is the question then, because our virtual objects are within the peripersonal space. Oh, all of them. I mean, they're all binocular stereo displays, as Emil explained. So we split a display in two, or we have 2 independent displays. There's several ways, but anyway, it's the same. We get a stereo display, basically, and it's driven by vergence and by disparity.
So maybe the question becomes more relevant when you're talking about VR systems and MR system that doesn't have the like a static kind of a lens. And any thought, like, what should we do in MR or VR systems that, you're focusing 1 meter and above and beyond, and then you want to render hands that are close by?
I mean, for now, in the absence, while maybe our friends, our local friends are solving that supposedly, Magic Leap seems to be the only product that so far support in their product multi-focal like depth of field, basically. But for now, we have a vergence accommodation config whenever we get away of our focal plane. But in terms of experience, and Emily is the expert, but in terms of experience from the use of the product, you start experiencing the fatigue from vergence accommodation mismatches after a while. Otherwise, your experience is driven more by vergence. Your depth, of course, accommodation is not driving much of you don't perceive your accommodation, right? But you perceive your vergence, and this is helping you to, and the disparity is helping you to project stimuli back and forth in your.
Maybe Emily and Jackie, you guys are like, what would happen like when you're rendering too close? Can you trade off between even stereo and non-stereo and eye fatigue? Like, any thoughts on there? How can you make your interaction more accurate?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in the question of peripersonal space, that varifocal optics, like David and I both talked about. Oh, sorry. The varifocal optics provide a potential kind of short-term solution to that type of problem, although at least the optics that my collaborators and I have worked with aren't really ready for prime time yet. It sounds like maybe you guys have some stuff that's a little bit closer. But I mean, I think that is problematic, and I think a lot of the use cases that we think about, particularly for AR, involve something where you're interacting with things directly. So I would just say, like, I agree that it's an issue. I don't think there is really a solid, like, consumer-ready solution for that yet. Right. Yeah. So you match them. Yeah.
All right, let's go to the next question, Jenny.
Hi. Yeah, I wanted to come back to this question of black. We've had some references to the fact in augmented reality that you can't take pixels of photons away. But I don't really follow why, especially given all the technical challenges you've already solved. It seems like it would be relatively trivial to have an LCD monitor, screen and a polarizer in front of the photonics you've already got, and then you could block incident light. Is a technical challenges just too great there?
So that particular suggestion I can answer directly. Yeah, the first thing that we thought of and everybody else thought of going back years and years in the patents when we looked is to put an LCD in front of you and just sort of like mat out things. That doesn't work for the reason that's obvious once you think about it, because there's an aperture of the pupil, right? The pupil is not a pinhole, and so this mat is so close to your face that it ends up being a drop shadow or a halo. So the other problem with we built a couple systems that use LCDs in front of your eye, and they also diffract the real world something awful. So you get rainbows everywhere. So yeah, you could imagine a relay system. People have built relay systems that relay things down to optical infinity, then do an LCD, and then relay it back out. And the problem with those is they're like this big, and they put everything in optical infinity. So no good solutions that in view that I see.
Super, very clear. Thank you.
Just maybe I want to dive deeper on this discussion. So, David, you mentioned that the AR can be fairly difficult because of the contrast and also field of view, right? Some people are investigating what would happen if you introduce MR, right? A pass-through camera, putting on a VR display. You resolve the contrast issue, and it can be done in a shorter term, right? Any thoughts from industry? Is that a viable interim solution?
So you're referring to video see-through.
Right.
Video see-through has some advantages, like it renders perfectly occlusions, for example, but it perturbs at the rendering, like current state of the art. It delays the entire scene, pretty much like virtual reality, and that creates the same user problems that, for example, remote surgery creates. The reason why they cannot do very accurate remote surgery in different parts of the world, and they have to be in adjacent rooms, is because of the transmission time and the delay. It's a perception and action problem. So you're going to delay the whole scene in a video see-through.
Isn't it true that for the camera, you can just go pass through right into the display, scan out? You don't have to do much processing if you design the optics well, and probably there's some tricks you could do. Suppose the latency is resolved. Would that, I don't know if NVIDIA...
So if the latency is resolved, all that's left is the resolution and the field of view and the fact that the pupil doesn't move with your pupil, and probably a few other things. So this is a great question, because there's even inside of video, there's different camps. Oh, I'm sorry, guys. So I don't believe that people will want to inherit all the limitations of a camera for everyday walking around AR, but Pokemon Go is an example that they're perfectly willing to do it for a specific task. So I, until the cameras are really, really good in terms of dynamic range and, yes, latency and resolution and field of view and stuff, then I'd rather try to find a solution personally, I'd rather find a solution for optical see-through and live with ghostly Princess Leia, and make all my icons white, as Robin sort of alluded to.
Yeah, going back to that.
Great question, though. Great topic.
I think I briefly mentioned that if you have bright objects around what you want to make look dark, it's fairly effective. Like you kind of almost hallucinate seeing dark or black pixels, at least in the HoloLens. And it's important to have something like that, because shadows, for instance, are a really useful hue for making that augmented or that virtual object appear grounded in your real world. Yeah.
All right, I want to make sure we get to all the questions. So next question.
Okay, so moving on to a problem that's sort of more at the software side. This might not be something that you folks think a lot about, but I was wondering about cognitive interference, right? So cognitive interference. So for example, in addition to physical occlusion, what about distracting people to the degree to which they can't do anything? How do you build that into or worry about that in a 24/7 augmented reality context?
I mean, the direction is to have a fully aware system that is aware of your physical world and your digital content altogether. That is the direction. I'm not saying that this is the current state of the art, because it implies a lot of different technologies and some form of AI and perfect object tracking and mapping and so forth. So it's by far the direction to go. I mentioned that in my talk when I said that, the attentional problems that creates. Yeah, you call it cognitive interference, but I think it's the same idea. We need to absolutely pay attention to that. We need to be fully aware in our system of what happens in the world, yes. But that is augmented reality. This is the ultimate augmented reality, that the system is fully aware of what you have around and delivers the right information, even in space.
I'll just add, I dream of, without meaning to be flip, because I think it's a really serious, interesting question. I dream of the day when we can ask that question on a real system. Like our displays are so lacking and so impoverished right now that I feel like there's a dozen other things in the way before we get to even ask the really hard cognitive design questions. You know, but I also believe that artificial intelligence essentially is gonna be the major helper there.
All right, let's do one more question.
Hi, I'm trying to figure out how to ask this, but so all of you brought up some long-term challenges for VR and AR, and I know that at least within VR in particular, it like kind of rose out of like a demand in gaming, like playing video games like in first person with like the headset. But do you think it's like going to be a fad, like it's going to fade away, like VR? And if so, do you think that there's enough drive in the industry and like research to keep working on these long-term challenges? Kind of how like the Microsoft Kinect, like long after people forgot about like motion controls, there's still like a demand to improve it and use it in research and like, because it's a really good camera and a good tool.
I know with the HoloLens, you know, part of the strategy has been to not just go after games, but actually most of the examples you showed at the end were for specific use cases. And like, for instance, that Tyson Group example I showed of using the HoloLens to measure the stairs, I forget what factor of speed increase it was, but it dramatically reduced the number of even days that technicians had to go out to somebody's home to measure all these things and plan things out. And then the customer can also see it in real time. So definitely, especially in enterprise, the companies are seeing the value. So I think that should help keep the technology around until we can get it to a consumer ready level.
Yeah, I think that is so first it's a very important, that's a very good point. I mean, and this is what, you know, like almost on a weekly basis, we have to make sure and keep our, like, it's not our role, but it's a business, it's like the business direction, but going like in the direction of prosumer to consumer, probably this is one of the pathways, professional consumers, and showing use cases that you help the business that way. For example, we show that creating motion and like volumetric representations of objects, that was a collaboration with Accenture, it was a paper at ISMAR. The time it takes to assemble something out of instruction improved by 20% relative to paper instruction. That was a Lego task, relatively difficult Lego assembly task. Traditional instructions versus 3D volumetric instructions, people were faster, much faster. So you prove the business case and then you create the supporting technology. That is a way to keep that alive. So probably not focusing on gaming, it's a important thing.
So what if we just ask it in a more general case, like if we break the use cases into two categories in terms of VR, when you're creating and AR creating content, playing games, right, drawing things, and the other case that is you're consuming content, mainly watching videos, right, 360 videos, imagine you're in a stadium and all that. From the industry perspective, what do you guys think? Is it a lot of like consuming, so streaming to the headsets that people you think will drive the demand, or will it be more interacting, gaming, drawing? I am assuming Meta is betting a lot on interaction, right?
I would say even another dimension that partially orthogonal to that, which is experiential versus useful and experiential in a way. And VR and AR will be probably polarizing around these two, like useful use case and use in the real world versus experiential consuming content. For example, there's a lot of industry around 360 degrees camera. They work only for VR, and it's great to watch that type of content. This is a VR pure content, right? They won't work for now for AR. There's some other.
Is NVIDIA doing anything specific for streaming, or?
What can I talk about? We're quite interested in streaming, I guess, as a short thing. Like, I'm trying to think of stuff we've announced. So at our GPU technology conference, which was last week, we've been doing a lot of work to sort of build SDKs to make it easy to, you know, for Jump and similar kinds of projects to ingest 360-degree video. We're also interested in but there's nothing announced, but we're also very interested in streaming 3D content. We have NVIDIA, for those of you who don't know, has a game streaming thing. Instead of buying a PC you log into a service and there's a PC somewhere in the cloud and you play your game, your PC game, your computer game, video game on this thing in the cloud. And so we've actually tackled a lot of the problems of ultra low latency streaming and bandwidth reduction, and so it feels like an obvious fit there. But of course, it's a totally different regime streaming into a VR device, which has to be hitting 90 frames per second at 20 milliseconds frame rate.
Yeah, let's squeeze in the final question.
Actually, I have two questions. One really short question is, well, in terms of augmented reality, how the dynamic range problem looks like in practice. Is it like almost there? Or is it kind of like there's a lot to be solved? And actually, second question is there if there's any discussion about the long-term consequence of using the near-eye display, for the visual functionality problems, like visual acuity, for example?
Tackle the long-term one.
Yeah, you're the one to talk.
So in terms of using a near-eye display, one of the features of most of these displays is that you're not actually focusing your eyes very near, because you can't. So the optical distance of the displays is actually similar to the optical distance of a display if you were sitting at a desktop. Sorry, apparently I am not close enough. But you're not actually focusing your eyes at an unnaturally near distance because there's always a lens in front of your eyes. I think in terms of the long-term consequences of the Virchent's accommodation conflict, I think there's been a little bit of work on that, suggesting that for certain things that have been measured, there aren't really any long-term measurable issues, but I think that's not over and done with yet. It's something that's still a continued area of study. I can tell you, I might not be the best person to answer the question about dynamic range in the AR from the company perspective, but as a user of the AR devices in our research, we find that the dynamic range is really nice for indoor room usage. It's very compelling and vibrant, but then as soon as we look out a window, then everything disappears, basically.
Emily and maybe Jackie, if you can elaborate more on that question, one effect is like long-term usage of these near-eye displays. The other one is like, what would happen as you transition in and out, right? Have you guys thought about like, what's the process of taking off a goggle? What's the process of putting a goggle?
Generally, the putting on is a slow process. As people get used to it, it's a little jarring the first time people put it on. They're excited, and then they realize that they have to kind of take it easy. But taking it off, people don't seem to have any problem. They just pick it right off. Having programmed experiments and had to do a lot of on-off, I find that I'm much slower at the process. I think over time, I sort of get into that environment, my eyes get used to it, and then I think I just, without realizing it, take it off more slowly so I can gradually adjust back to the real world. So I do think that it is a consideration I hadn't considered previously. And in terms of just long-term use, I don't think I've used it long enough. We have our participants use it about 10 to 15 minutes at a time, and then they take a break. And for the most part, our task is pretty mundane. And at most, people say they feel a little tired or maybe a little blurry or dizzy, but we haven't come up against any limitations so far. So.
I would just say that Jenny Reed, who's here, I think has done a couple of studies looking at both short-term and long-term consequences, both perceptual and I think like some balance and coordination stuff. And my recollection, and I'll look for like a yes or a no, is that she hasn't measured any substantial side effects in any of those studies. Is that correct? Nothing long-lasting is what Jenny says.
I guess my experience is that if people have negative experiences, they're going to manifest sooner rather than later. So there's specifically motion sickness. People figure this out very quickly, and if they don't show them, they don't seem to be showing up later.
Okay. One quick comment. I just want to give a shout out. I think the high dynamic range problem is a huge one from the design, display engineering point of view. And I only know of one really solid work in that, and it's work that's just come out of the University of North Carolina. A grad student named Peter Lincoln has designed a display which has two amazing attributes. One, it has great dynamic range. It can easily handle, looking out the window all the way to dark indoor environments in the same scene. And two, it has 120 microseconds of latency. It's also the size of a room. It's not ready for prime time, but if anybody's interested in that work, Peter Lincoln at UNC is the best work I know of in that space.
All right, thank you. So at this point, I just wanted to take an opportunity to thank the speakers and thank everybody for attending. So I think it's pretty clear that we're all very excited. So I just wanted to point out a couple of VR and AR related things that are coming up in the next days. So all the speakers will be around now, and I'm sure they'll be hungry, so they're going to be at the reception as well. So now that you know them, you can just come up to them. We have the industry job fair on Saturday morning. Then we have another VR and eye tracking related symposium on Saturday during lunch. And then finally, as I mentioned, there's going to be VR and AR setups during demo night. And you're all, of course, hopefully we'll see you there. Thanks a lot.